right. And can you see and hear me? See my screen?
Yes. Yes.
All right. So we've heard about and again, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for the time you're taking to look at these issues and really try to move the field forward in addressing reparations in this country. So starting with a thank you. So in the last talk, we've heard a lot about intergenerational transmission. I'm going to be talking about transgenerational epigenetic inheritance and how it relates to systemic racism in the United States. As was discussed last presentation, it's well established that personal experiences of trauma, adversity, and discrimination can get under the skin and increase risk for a whole host of negative mental and physical health problems. There is emerging data now also that confirms negative exposures in one generation can be passed down to affect the health and well-being of future generations through what we call transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And the notion that there's generational trauma that can be passed on was first acknowledged by a Canadian psychiatrist who saw very elevated rates of anxiety in the children of Holocaust survivors. Since then, people have also found elevated rates of anxiety in the grandchildren, and other types of adversities like exposure to famine or toxins have actually been found to affect the health across multiple generations. So transgenerational epigenetic inheritance is how the negative effects and adversities of traumas in one generation can be passed down to affect the health and well-being of future generations. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren can be negatively impacted by ancestral traumas, even when they have not been directly exposed to any harms themselves. So there's a couple key concepts that I'm going to go over in terms of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And some of these, Dr. Carrazza, thank you for introducing the concepts. The first is epigenetic modifications. Those are chemical modifications to the genes that affect the likelihood of a given gene product being made, with gene products being things like proteins and hormones that our bodies need to stay healthy. Epigenetic modifications are not gene mutations. Gene mutations interrupt the codes used to make the gene products, so they may not be built right. Epigenetic modifications just turn genes on and off, but do not affect the codes used to create the gene products. So we already learned how epigenetic mechanisms are one of the ways in which experience of trauma can get under the skin. Okay, for the environmentally induced epigenetic modifications to be inherited across generations, they have to make it to the germline, the sperm and the egg, because those are the only two cells that are going to create subsequent life. Now, most of the research looking at transgenerational epigenetic inheritance has used animal models, and you can control animals in a way that you can't quite control. We don't have really the sort of multi-generational studies where we've looked at these mechanisms, or not very many of them, where we've looked at them in humans. And it's also sometimes hard where some of the experiences that lead to epigenetic changes in one generation are experienced by subsequent generations. So in these animal models, the first generation is called the F0. So that's the animal that's exposed. As we've learned, their offspring can be exposed as well. So if F0 is exposed, F1, the child is considered exposed as well. That's kind of a multi-generational exposure. And that we can't really look at transgenerational epigenetics until the F2 generation, the great-grandchildren. Because the transgenerational epigenetic inheritance requires that the negative outcomes associated with exposure be evident in generations with no history of exposure. So it would be the F2 generation in males, because the F1, the sperm, the egg are, within that body and would have gotten some exposure. If it's a female, it's going to be the F3 generation, because F0 is exposed, F1's eggs are exposed, and F2 is created from the eggs of F1. So you have to get all the way down to the great-grandchild to really call it transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, where negative outcomes despite no exposure.
Dr. Kaufman, excuse me, your slides are not advancing. Are you advancing your slides?
Really? I am. You're not seeing anything?
Not seeing anything except your first slide, and it's not in play mode. So you have to put it in slideshow?
I am in slideshow on mine, so let's figure out what's not happening correctly on the share.
And then at least we can see them, but now I see a different slide.
You're now on slide 7.
Okay.
So if I go, but then we won't be able to have the animation. So you can see this now, but if I go like this, you can't see me advance? You didn't see that advance?
No.
Can you click on that slideshow and see what happens?
Yeah, well, I did do this. I don't know if there's a different place to do slideshow from here. Let's see if we try.
Are you running on a Mac?
I am.
You need to put it in slideshow mode first. And then remember we discussed the command tab, and then you have to
walk me through it. Tell me what you want me to do.
Okay.
So should I put my PowerPoint slide?
So stop sharing.
Okay. I'm sorry.
It's
Okay. Stop share. Okay, now put your PowerPoint in slideshow mode.
Okay.
Okay, and then go command tab, and you should see across the middle of your screen your different tabs. And then go back to BlueJeans and share screen, share window.
Right.
There you go.
Okay,
Now
I'm
when
really
you-
sorry about that.
That's okay. Now when you advance, you should be able to advance fine.
Okay, should I just sort of start from the beginning again? Does that make sense? I'm sorry that I wasn't aware that wasn't working. All right, I will quickly go through, since I think hearing words without seeing pictures sometimes is a little bit discombobulating. All right, so following up on the last talk, it is well established that personal experiences of trauma, adversity, and discrimination can get under the skin and increase risk for a whole host of negative mental health and physical health problems. Emerging data now also confirms that negative exposures in one generation can be passed down to affect the health and well-being of future generations through what's called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And we talked about the notion of transgenerational inheritance initially came from some of the work in Holocaust survivors, but has been shown in terms of exposure to famine, toxins as well. And transgenerational epigenetics is how the negative effects of adversities and traumas in one generation can be passed down to affect the health and well-being of future generations, such that grandchildren and great-grandchildren can be negatively impacted by ancestral traumas, even when they've not been directly exposed to any harms themselves. So some of the key concepts which we've talked about, epigenetic modifications, they're chemical modifications. They affect the likelihood of a given gene product being made, with gene products being things like proteins, hormones, things our bodies need to stay safe. Again, they are not gene mutations. Gene mutations affect the codes that are used to make genes, so the products may not be made right. These epigenetic modifications just turn genes on and off. Epigenetics, as we heard, is one of the ways that adversity can get under the skin. And in order for these environmentally induced epigenetic chemical changes to the genes to be inherited across generations, they have to be in the sperm and the egg, because the sperm and the egg are the only two cells that create subsequent life. All right, so this is the animal model. Yeah, so trying to listen to what I was saying with this animal model without the picture really must have been confusing. So thank you for stopping me. All right, F0 generation is the one that's going to get the exposure. Since the sperm and the eggs are inside that animal, the next generation is considered exposed as well. And true transgenerational inheritance doesn't happen until the F2 generation in the male, or the female if they're not pregnant. If the female is pregnant, F0 is exposed, her eggs are exposed, and then the child that's made from her eggs is considered exposed. It takes all the way to the F3, to the great-grandchildren, to be considered really true transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, so that the F2 and F3 generation will have had no exposures, and that would be our test as to whether we're really getting transmission without any exposure. Okay, so one of the first experiences, so I think this is where we're picking back up. that was able to show, and it's an experiment in something called fear conditioning, which is an animal analog for trauma exposure. So in this first generation, FC generation, shock was paired with an odor. So that after a period of time where every time an animal smells something, they get shocked, just the smell is going to make them have a big fear response. So in doing this, they found that the F1, the children, and the F2 grandchildren had an increased fear response to that smell that the F0 one got shocked for, okay? But they didn't show any fear response to other odors, and they had absolutely no exposure to the odor or to the shocks. So that trauma experience kind of got passed down, even though they themselves had nothing that kind of, no shock experience. These F0 and the F1 mice, are you able to see my cursor when I'm pointing? No one's responding. Well, I'm hoping you can, but I'm not sure if you can.
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you. So the F0 and the F1 mice who were subject and their offspring, they had epigenetic marks in the sperm and a gene that was critical to smell perception. So again, it kind of highlights this is not a random gene. They get shocked when they have a smell, and we're seeing changes in genes that are involved in smell perception. The F0 conditioning was also associated with changes in brain regions for smell perception, actually in both the F1 and the F2. So this experience of trauma affected the brains of the children and grandchildren. And then to just really demonstrate that it got passed on through the sperm, they did in vitro fertilization experiments where they took sperm from the, traumatized and non-traumatized animals with a neutral egg, created an offspring, and those offspring had those same sort of changes to the brain, even though they had none of the trauma experiences. So one of the first studies showing that experiences of adversity can really be passed on transgenerationally, and that it really does seem to be passed on through the sperm. Another study is looking at, and we've heard a lot about stress during pregnancy and its impact. And so rats were exposed to stress when they were pregnant, and they looked across 4 generations where some were stressed and some were not. And as we saw in humans, stress reduced maternal weight, gestational length, increased maternal glucose levels across the generations. And we also saw that stress decreased birth weight, which we've talked about. But what's also important to see, the effect was actually greatest in the transgenerationally stressed animals. So there was stress in the first generation, but not the next 3 generations. And that great-grandchild had the lowest birth weight. So that we see that the impact of some of these things really can get passed on even when there's not ongoing adversity. In addition, the offspring of prenatally, multi-generationally, and transgenerationally stressed animals had developmental delays. And a multi-generational history of prenatal stress was associated with changes in genes that are implicated in brain plasticity, childbirth, and preterm birth. So again, not random genes that we're seeing changed in association with these multi-generational traumas. And so the documentation of an impact of transgenerational and multi-generational stress on preterm birth is particularly interesting, given that the racial disparities that we have in preterm birth. And there are also findings that even with adequate prenatal care, it doesn't completely reduce the racial disparities, with African American women who engage in adequate prenatal care still at elevated risk for preterm birth. So understanding these mechanisms is important. All right, another study which looked at transgenerational epigenetic inheritance looked at the high-fat diet, and again, this was actually in the males, and there's a lot of information that high-fat diet can impact the health of descendants across multiple generations. So in this study, F0, the first generation of male rats were either fed a high-fat diet or normal chow diet. And the F0 male rats that had the high-fat diet and their F1 offspring had common sperm epigenetic changes in genes that are implicated in glucose homeostasis, insulin sensitivity, and type 2 diabetes. So we are seeing changes once again in key genes through the transmission of early negative exposures. All right, the next study was looking at the transgenerational epigenetic inheritance related to lead exposure. And this study was actually done in zebrafish. And the F0 first generation were exposed to 24 hours of waterborne lead. Then the F0 generation zebrafish were then raised to adulthood, and they looked at F1 and F2, so grandchildren and children, and they had the grandchildren and children had no direct exposure to the lead. They were then studied. And what we found is that F0 exposed to dosages of lead that they've found, could produce learning impairments. And I have to confess, I have no idea how you do learning experiences with zebrafish, but I'm glad someone knows how to do them. So they had the F0 exposed to an amount of lead that's previously been shown to have lead to learning impairments, and that they found the F2 generation of the F0 exposed fish who had, again, no direct exposure themselves, had similar learning impairments. So the difficulties in learning were passed on despite the absence of lead exposure in those subsequent generations. The F2 offspring of those F0 exposed zebrafish also had alteration in genes that are involved in brain development and also some epigenetic processes, leading the way to start to understand how lead-induced neurobehavioral deficits, cognitive deficits, and the like may in fact be inherited across generations. So some key summaries. Emerging research confirms that the negative exposures in one generation can be passed down to affect the health and well-being of future generations through transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, the transgenerational transmission, and of these experience-dependent chemical modifications to the genes. And while most of the research to date has been conducted in animals, studies in humans have also shown that ancestors exposed to trauma, poor nutrition, toxic chemicals, as we've discussed, can impact the health of descendants across several generations. And some of those epigenetic modifications that have been noted in animal studies have also been reported in humans. Okay, for the environmentally induced epigenetic modifications to be inherited across generations, they must be contained in the germline, sperm, and eggs, and that's now been demonstrated in multiple studies. The causal significance of these epigenetic changes have been demonstrated. I talked about one in vitro fertilization studies, but there have been others, so really showing kind of causal significance. And then again, the biological relevance of the genes that are regulated by these epigenetic marks really kind of add compelling support for the role of these mechanisms in transmission of experience-dependent traits and health problems. So there's a little bit of an upside. So I'm going to talk about preventing the transmission of the negative effects of ancestral traumas. And I'm probably thinking both personal traumas and ancestral traumas. So the first study we looked at was one of these fear conditioning trauma type experiences where the odor and the shock was paired together. So in the first experiment, you see there's a pairing of, here it's a sound with a shock, and you see that there's a rise in the animal's kind of fear response. And that then when you then just give the sound, that animal still has a really heightened fear response. So they've been conditioned, fear conditioned to the sound of that particular noise. In extinction training, what they do is basically you just hear the sound, and a shock never comes. And eventually, over time, the animal stops having the fear response, so that they can then just hear the sound again and there's no major fear response. And the notion of extinction training and why I put treatment there, it's really at the core of most evidence-based treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder. Prolonged exposure. Talk about your trauma, learn relaxation therapy, be able to do cognitive processing, rethink about what happened. And so extinction is really a core part of what our evidence-based treatments are for trauma. So in this study, the first generation, either did or didn't have the extinction training or the treatment. And when the animals had that initial fear conditioning, but they got the treatment, they no longer showed a response of fear to the sound, and they also didn't have changes in the sperm. So that the treatment prevented both the behavioral outcome as well as the changes in the sperm. And what they also found is that it also prevented there being any fear response in the next generation. So both generations stopped showing those behavioral changes. And it does appear that trauma treatment can prevent the transgenerational transmission of the negative effects associated with ancestral traumas. Other studies that they've done that have been shown in animals to prevent the negative effects of ancestral traumas, with the high-fat diet, they've found that giving a healthy diet and exercise prevented the epigenetic sperm changes and the transmission of obesity and diabetes. Enrichment has been found to be an incredibly powerful thing. So, in the rats, you get all sorts of fun stuff in the cage. So there's the living's enhanced by toys, rich social, physical, and sensory experiences. And that prevented the negative outcomes associated with prenatal stress and lead exposure. All right, so if we take and say, how can we extrapolate this to really prevent, and here I say both the negative effects of personal and ancestral traumas in the human studies. Many of you may or may not be familiar with the Carolina, and I'm not going to probably say it correctly, Aborigine, I'm not sure I'm saying that project, but it's probably one of the most rigorous studies looking at the impact of high quality early education. And this was for kids from 0 to 5. It was a randomized control trial. And the benefits were not just in, the individuals who participated in the program, the offspring of the program. They were found to have fewer school suspensions, less criminal problems, greater educational attainment, employment relative to the children in the control group. So providing outstanding educational enrichment in one generation improved the outcomes of the next generation. You guys are out in California. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Stanford Medical Youth Science Program, but it provides enrichment in the medical sciences and college admission support to very low-income minority high school students, most with poor academic preparation. And to date, there have been, or at least the last published paper had 400 students who've been through this. 99% were admitted to college. And again, they did not have good academic preparation before the program began. 81% earned a 4-year college degree, and among the 4-year college graduates, 52% are attending either graduate or medical school. So really remarkable. I think a lot of times when we think about intervention, we think birth to 3, birth to 5. Point is, adolescence is another period of rapid brain development. We don't want to be forgetting about our older youth when we think about prevention and really the power of these types of enrichment programs and really changing life course. I don't know if you are familiar with Strong African American Families. It was originally developed in rural income African American families, but has since been replicated in multiple urban areas around the country. It's designed to enhance the parent-child relationship, as well as address kind of unique issues related to being an African American youth, like racial socialization, racism. It's a combined intervention. It's usually done where there's a meal served and there's some work that's done with the parents about how do you, monitor and protect your child with youth. How do you focus towards the future, as well as address some of these issues around racism. They've been a very relatively large-scale randomized control trial. And the youth had this program starting at age 11, long-term follow-up into early adulthood. And the outcomes include decreased rates of conduct problems, decreased rates of smoking, drinking, drug use, risky sex behaviors in late adolescence and early adulthood, and reduced risk of obesity and prediabetes in young adulthood. And as we heard, adverse childhood experience are often associated with an increased risk for things like diabetes and all sorts of other health problems. Among the youth who were part of this safe, Strong African American Families intervention, adverse childhood experiences did not increase risk for prediabetes, but among the youth in the control group, each additional adversity was associated with a 37% increased risk for prediabetes. So this intervention really found a way to mitigate the effects of personal adversities. In addition, the intervention was associated with decreasing the impact of family risk factors on all sorts of biological systems, the stress system, inflammation, and epigenetic markers. And it was also associated with diminishing the impact of poverty on hippocampal and amygdala brain volume, which are two main regions of the brain that are impacted by stress. So really highlighting that there's a way in which we can mitigate these negative effects. So preliminary data suggests the negative impact of ancestral traumas can be prevented And there's a role for trauma-informed services, culturally adapted prevention and intervention programs, and enrichment opportunities are strongly indicated. Just to be, limited time, can't really talk about it, but the reality is that true change and healing, however, requires that the acknowledgement of the harms that were done and broader systemic and policy level changes, because there are many things that perpetuate cycles of disadvantage and adversity. So I think I can stop sharing. Did I stop sharing? I'm good? All right, thank you.